Hi folks, welcome to English 261 week 4. This week we'll be talking about Middle Ages and Restoration poetry. I'll also go over the haiku assignment, which will be your next poetry project you'll be working on, in addition to critiquing the two poetry projects you've already done. So what I want to start with is there's a huge kind of jump you'll notice from the span I cover in this week. And the reason I cover so much in this week, for a variety of reasons, Middle Ages poetry is fairly redundant. And that's not to say it's necessarily bad. It's not to say it's necessarily uninteresting. It's definitely interesting from a heavily historical standpoint. But medieval poetry, especially in English, tends to be very, very, very rooted in lyric. It's very much based on lyrics and ballads and songs and things like that. And while they're very, very interesting historically, in terms of a metrical standpoint, in terms of what you're going to learn about line length and what you're going to learn about rhyme scheme and things along those lines, you're not going to get a whole heck of a lot out of this kind of poetry, at least in terms of thinking about poetics from a style standpoint. The style is pretty consistent across the time period. And part of the reason Middle Ages poetry is fairly redundant is simply because during the Middle Ages in England, the favored written language was extensively Latin. People had a language, but ultimately there was so much church domination in this time period that really Latin was the preferred written language. So most of the poetry, even in English poetry, or even the real big leaps in poetry that happened in the Middle Ages, were very much Latin-based and Romance language-based, and happened in the European continent. There were definite writers who wrote and used the English common vernacular language. For example, Chaucer did. There were others, Langland, things along those folks. But generally speaking, when they were trying to do this, they were trying to communicate to a common audience, or to write something popular that would sell, or they were focused very intently on writing things that they weren't necessarily going to try and market to the upper echelons of society. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing by any means whatsoever. It's actually a very good thing. Chaucer, I actually kind of adore. But ultimately, a lot of the work that was being done, a lot of the work that was poetically being done, was being done in Latin. So for us, for our purposes, that doesn't bring a whole lot of jumps and leaps in terms of what the English language is capable of doing poetically. But it also doesn't... it also means that a lot of the stuff that we have recorded from that time is Latin, not in English, and it's in translation in some cases, but not in others. So we do have poetry from that time period, from the Middle Ages, but for the most part... during the Middle Ages, ballads and lyrics and epic poems ruled the land. And you can see it's when we start to get, there of course, like I said, there are some really big things along those years, like Piers Plowman, things along those lines. A lot of it had a very strong religious bent. Pearl is kind of a very kind of strong one that has kind of a strong religious bent to it. The lyrics... songs, things along those lines. A lot of it has a very kind of religious focus in the Middle Ages as well, which, I mean, like I said, it can be interesting in some cases, but in other cases it does get a little bit redundant after a while. Which is why I actually have you folks read Chaucer. And the reason I have you read Chaucer is because I actually think, if you take a look at... The Canterbury Tales, if you've never read it, by the way, is a great read. If you take English 449A, which is Lit 1, there's a very good chance you're going to read a chunk of the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is probably... I think you can make a strong argument that aside from Beowulf, the Canterbury Tales is really the first masterpiece of long-written poetic work in the English language. Canterbury Tales is an amazing piece of work, and it's almost in some ways encyclopedic to the time it was writing about, because it was discussing people heading off on the Crusades. And it covered so many different aspects of social classes. It covered so many different aspects of religion and so many different flaws and errors in thinking. It's really kind of just an amazing piece of work. Almost kind of like, if you like Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, it's kind of the Gravity's Rainbow of its time. It's kind of the Great Gatsby of its time. It's a real masterpiece of medieval literature, and I would say it's probably one of the most interesting pieces written in the English language. So the general prologue is very interesting. There's the Wife of Bath, is a hilarious, hilariously bawdy kind of narrative that I think is an interesting read, especially if you figure out what all the different things he's referring to are and you kind of figure out the references. It takes on a whole different interpretation. Chaucer is really interesting because Chaucer very much was a writer for the people. And when Chaucer wrote, one of the things I've always loved about Chaucer in particular is Chaucer was extremely witty, but he was also incredibly practical and incredibly interested in people of all sorts. Generally speaking, a lot of the literature written in this time period, especially written for the upper classes, is written in praise of the upper classes because thanks to the patronage system, the upper class were really the individuals that supported the arts. So a lot of the art that's written in this time period is either praising religion, which would fund artists, or it was praising the upper classes, who would fund artists. There's not a lot of stuff written about the lower and middle classes, and Chaucer was really kind of interested in these kinds of people. And Chaucer, he was also very witty, but also very, very practical. And in some ways, I think Chaucer kind of sets a kind of role model almost for later people will run into in British literature. Jonathan Swift in some ways is very much working in Chaucer's mode. Oscar Wilde to some extent is very much working in Chaucer's mode. That combination of witticism and social critique and just a really interesting viewpoint on culture. And I really, the reason I have you read Complaint to His Purse and To His Scribe Adam is because I think Chaucer does a really good job of reminding us it reminds us that anything can be poetic. People tend to have this illusion that poetry is... People often believe that poetry is about massive and sweeping ideas or images or things. But Chaucer really kind of writes about life and the ugly and the good and the sublime and the filthy. And I think he does it with love and an intention in all kinds of ways. I don't think Chaucer drew a lot of distinctions between what was and wasn't interesting. I think Chaucer to some extent found everything interesting, which I think really is why the Canterbury Tales is such an interesting read. Also, by the way, if you ever get interested in philology, the roots of words and where words come from, if you spend any time with an OED, you're going to see Chaucer's name come up tons and tons of times because a lot of the words that were used in the Canterbury Tales are the first appearance of certain words in the English language simply because of the encompassing scope of the text itself. So, let's go ahead and talk about Chaucer. And the other thing I think it's worth mentioning about Chaucer is Chaucer, in Chaucer, we see a metrical cleverness that was a bit beyond its time. So, for example, if you read Complaint to His Purse, to you my person, to no one other white, complain I for ye, be my lady dear, I'm so sorry now that ye be light, for certes, but if ye make me heavy cheer. There's rhymes, and there's a rhyme pattern to this, but there's also he's also doing a very kind of good job of using interesting meter. And the meter's not as sing-songy as a ballad or a lyric. He's doing a little bit more interesting job of using a metrical structure, a rhythm structure, not so much rhythm structure, but using a rhyme structure that stands out but doesn't necessarily over-announce itself or whack you over the head with it, which you run into in some of the other poems we've read. The other thing I think is really kind of funny is this is all about being broke. And I think that's kind of something that apparently Chaucer had problems with throughout his life. He would be kind of high on the hog, then kind of spend all his money, then be broke, and then have to figure out something else to do. And he was a fairly and it's interesting because in some ways this very much reminds me of what we'll run into when we run into like the beat poets and Charles Bukowski and things like that, writing about kind of the hard scrabble living of the day to day. And I think that Chaucer kind of sets the tone for that right here, and I think he's really kind of does in a very, very funny way. And he's basically just saying, I need money. Please help me. I need money. And the ends with "Be heavy again, or else I might die." It's basically the image of a guy yelling at his wallet, saying, "Please get heavy. I need something. We're broke." And I think that even continues itself into his Scribe Adam, which is the other poem I had you read, which I actually think it's hilarious because it's basically, it seems to be very much the poet complaining that the scribe, the person who copies it, who's copying his work, is doing a crappy job. And it's basically, it almost feels like a note to a scribe to say, hey, you're doing an awful job at this. And I actually wonder, it almost feels to some extent, and it seems almost like a kind of glorious Chaucerian joke that he would actually write this poem, give it to his copyist, and say, hey, copy this, and then the scribe would realize it was all about him, which I think is kind of a really kind of interesting, fun thing to do. And I thought it's very kind of clever and sharp, and I thought it was very telling of what the kind of humor you find in Chaucer. When Chaucer's humor is just not flat out bawdy, which happens a fair amount as well. So I just wanted to kind of hit on Chaucer a little bit as we were going through this. Once I went through Chaucer, then we went to Henry Howard. Okay. So here's where we kind of get, and this almost, to some extent, it's a translation from a Petrarch rhyme. And one of the reasons I wanted to have folks look at this is for the simple fact, and it comes from the Petrarch collection of poetry. And one of the things I kind of wanted, reasons I wanted to talk about Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and why I want to talk about this poem, is because early English poetry is heavily influenced by Latin poetry. And by that I mean it's influenced by the classic Italian, the classic Greek, Roman, and Romance language and Latin poets. So it's heavily influenced by Homer, it's heavily influenced by Cicero, it's heavily influenced by Petrarch. There's all kinds of different writers of that time period and the playwrights of all that time period who really, really heavily influenced not only Ovid is part of that as well. So the classic Greek, Roman, and Romance Latin poets were really kind of the ones who heavily influenced Greek and English and influenced English poetry. And the first English poets, early English poets, kind of were modeling themselves off of the kind of those old forms. So a lot of the early forms we encounter here, such as the form we encounter in That Love Doth Reign and Live Within My Thought, is very much kind of rooted in kind of Greek and Latin poetry. It uses similar structures in terms of rhyme, it uses similar structures in terms of line length, and it even uses kind of the same material, this kind of overwhelming, overarching welling up of emotion that becomes really, really popular in the Romance period. It almost is taken to its absurd limit. But that's kind of very much for it's got religious tones, it's got romantic tones, it's got kind of all that courtly kind of stuff that came out of the Middle Ages kind of built into it. And we kind of see this as we get moving more and more towards modern poetry, that's one of the things that ends up happening is that the upper class who were writing poetry and are interested in poetry very much model their work on Latin poetry and kind of historical poets from Latin, Greek, and Roman roots. And one of the reasons that is because around the same time that we enter the reign of Queen Elizabeth, it was we enter the Restoration. And the Restoration is a period of English history where the Normans are finally removed from rule over England, and the English again rule themselves. It's the end of a very, very long occupation. And England enters into a Renaissance period with the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Now, before I had us come to Elizabeth, I introduced we read Anne Askew's poem. And the reason I wanted to read Anne Askew's poem is, first of all, because it's really kind of, it's someone's poem who was written while being basically tried for heresy or being suspected of heresy. And it was written in Newgate Prison. There will be other poems that will be written from prisons that we will come across here. Oscar Wilde comes to mind. But one of the reasons I wanted to have you read Anne Askew's poem is to point out, first of all, she uses kind of very short, tight lines to kind of create tension in the poem, which I think is something worthwhile to note. Also, she uses line scream, but she also uses a fair amount of indirect rhyme, which I actually find kind of refreshing. It makes it a strong, there's a lot of strong lines here, so she uses among and strong instead of having that kind of direct rhyme. Among and strong sound like a little bit different, so it's not as usually on point as you might have found in other poets prior to this, but also that kind of short lines I think are doing a very, very effective job of creating tension and creating the sense of energy and power, which I think is one of the things that's interesting about this poem, because it's really about that power of someone facing death, but wanting to do so with dignity and wanting to do so in such a way that honors God and also defies the captors to some extent, while still wishing them salvation. But what happens is, with Queen Elizabeth, we enter into an English Renaissance. And a couple of things that happen during this time is, one, England becomes a cosmopolitan nation, or it becomes a little more of a cosmopolitan nation than it had been in the past. And part of the reason that happened is simply because England is a major port, and because of this, England also has a growing and wealthy middle and trading class. And before this, prior to this time, England was viewed as the shabbier of the nations of Europe. Really, for most of the Middle Ages and for a strong portion of European history up until really the reign of Queen Elizabeth, England is viewed kind of as the backwater of Europe. The real things they tend to believe, people believe are happening in Paris, they're happening in Rome, they're happening in Greece, they're happening in Italy, Germany. Those are the places that people are really kind of focused on. In the beginning, really the centers of civilization in Europe are in continental Europe. And England is kind of viewed as this backwater. Once the Restoration happens and England starts actually profiting and turning money and starts becoming kind of a trading hub and starts building universities and things like that, England kind of steps into its own as more of a cosmopolitan nation in European society. And part of the reason that happens is one of the things that happens as a result of that is because of this resurgence of England as an economic and foreign power, there is a need to build a national identity for England. And this tends to be the work of culture and the arts. And one of the things that happens during Queen Elizabeth's reign is Queen Elizabeth is an art lover, and she really extensively patronizes the arts in London. And the reason she patronizes the arts so heavily is because, first of all, she's well aware that England is a new nation, needs to kind of forge its own identity. It's also broken with the church somewhat at this point. It hasn't fully split off from the church yet, but it's made some of it's definitely made some definite breaks with the church. Actually, I think they have broke with the church at this point, if memory serves. Yeah. I'm pretty sure the church, England has more or less broke with the church, or at least is close to doing so, or closer to doing so than it had been in the past. So, you know what? I'll look it up. Silly not to. Find out when the Anglican Church was founded. And by the way, for some things, Wikipedia is actually pretty darn handy. Anglican Church. The Church of England. History. Separation from Rome. There we go. Yep. Break in 1534. So at this point, the English are in fact separated from Rome. England had separated from Rome and needed to establish its own cultural identity separate from those who had conquered it, as well as the church they'd walked away from. And to be fair, the Normans had been thrown out a period prior to this, but there was a long period of unrest in England following the removal of the Normans, when people were basically fighting and feuding to figure out who was going to be in charge of the country, which tends to happen every time an invading or occupying power tends to leave, as there tends to be a fight for who's going to replace them. So that happened in England as well. And also through that, England under Henry VIII finally broke with the Roman Church. And that kind of left England in an interesting place, because it left England as a nation that was growing in economic power and growing in wealth, but it also left England in a place where they weren't quite sure what they were. Their identity wasn't as firm as it was, and there was still tensions with what they called the Papists, the people who still believed in the Roman Catholic Church, but also the people who were interested in the Church of England. And there was a lot of internal strife in England at this time. And one of the ways that that was addressed was through art and culture, and kind of creating some idea of an English identity. And for someone such as Queen Elizabeth, poetry and art and identifying, creating art that was English, in English, and reflective of an English identity was incredibly important during the Restoration and Renaissance. And this is when there's a really big resurgence in art in England in this time period. This is the time period under Elizabeth that you get Shakespeare. This is the time period under Elizabeth you get the works of Christopher Marlowe. This is also the time period where you get a very, very classic poem that I did not have you read, simply because it's incredibly long and very kind of complex, and called The Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser. And The Faerie Queene is a classic epic poem that was actually written more or less for Queen Elizabeth, but is all about early English history and early English mythology, and is really kind of a work of building an English identity. And I think it's an interesting piece in that regard. But we actually kind of see a birth of English art and English artistry, or a growth of English art and artistry in this time period, and people writing in English and experimenting with what poetry can do in the English language. I actually have you read Sir Walter Raleigh's A Vision upon the Faerie Queene. This was actually included in the Faerie Queene, 2 editions of it, of the epic poem. And what it is it's Sir Walter Raleigh, a noble, commenting on the quality of the Faerie Queene. And one of the things that it's basically, if you read through it, the basic claim is that Spenser has stolen poetry and the power of poetry and the grace of poetry from the Romans and the English, and he's brought it here and do something different. Where Homer's sprite, Homer of course is the classic, did tremble all for grief and cursed the access of that celestial thief. The celestial thief they're talking about is Edmund Spenser. Spenser has really stolen the power and fire, and he's taken it on himself from the Greeks and the Romans. And what Raleigh's really doing is he's saying that this is our Homer, this is our Petrarch, this is our Greek poets, and his work is rival to theirs. It's as good as theirs, it's better than theirs, it surpasses theirs. So he's making a very kind of bold claim in that poem that English poetry has come into its own with Edmund Spenser. And Spenser's The Faerie Queene is definitely an interesting read, but there's kind of a very kind of strong, and it's very much the poem about poetics, which I think is one of the things you start running into is more meta-poetics, and you'll run into this more as we keep going here. But I think it's a very, very interesting piece, in as much as it does kind of call into question, and it does kind of point to Spenser as England's great and foremost poet, and it does do a very kind of good job of bringing that idea forward that England is taking its own in the world of arts and developing its own culture, and that culture is as strong and as powerful as does the Greek and Rome, which in a nation building exercise is kind of an important thing to do. So that's one of the interesting things about the piece. Additionally, I had you read Thomas Nash's Summer's Last Will. And if you're wondering how long is the Faerie Queene, the answer is very, very long. It's not even fully reproduced here. In English 449b, if you take it, or 449a, there's a chance you may well read the Faerie Queene. It's an interesting piece. When I taught it, I actually had students read the Faerie Queene as opposed to reading Paradise Lost, because I think Faerie Queene's a little bit more interesting. Paradise Lost, of course, is a classic poem by John Milton. So... But then we get to, and by the way, we're not skipping Shakespeare. We'll read the sonnets when we go through. Thomas Nash's Summer's Last Will. One of the things I think is really interesting about this poem, and one of the reasons I wanted to point it out, is because this poem makes really extensive use of internal rhyme and also onomatopoeia. And in some ways, this is very similar to the lyrics and ballads we've run into before, but it does a very interesting... job, and it is kind of ballad in structure, but it's more complex than the ballads we've run into. So we're actually, as like I said before, seeing more experimentation in this poem with the language. Spring, the sweet spring, is the year's pleasant king, then blooms each thing, then maids dance in a ring, could doth not sting, the pretty birds do sing. And then you've got that, but there's this really kind of interesting use of the internal rhyme inside the lines. It also plays across all the lines. There's internal rhyme, but there's also end rhyme in these, which I think is really kind of interesting. So there's assonance, but there's also alliteration, and there's also different kinds of rhyme structures in this. And that's kind of the reason I wanted you to read it, is because it's got that song structure, but it uses very interesting rhyme in a different way than we've seen in some of the past lyrics and ballads, where it's simple rhyme in the end of both lines. Here there's rhyme inside the lines, but also rhyme across lines, so I think it's a really kind of interesting effect. And it does make it very, very sing-songy and bouncy and very spring-like, and I thought that was kind of interesting just to kind of point out that you see this, you begin to see more complex uses of rhyme and language here. In John Donne's The Sun Rising, the reason I have you read this is just simply because I think the images here are extremely beautiful, and I think it's very much kind of a classic and interesting love poem. in just kind of very uses of good uses of rhyme and kind of indirect rhyme. I think it's not quite as hit you in the face or is in the nose as some of the other poems we've read. Also, this uses kind of varying line lengths, which I think is really interesting as well. There's some very interesting metrical techniques here, and I do recommend that everyone take the time to just kind of analyze what's going on here and kind of break down the lines and structures, because you begin to see in this time period more complex uses of line length in meter and also rhyme as well, and I think that's one of the kind of defining features. And John Donne is also kind of a classic poet from this time period, very, very well remembered, very many lovely poems. And A Valediction of Weeping is the same kind of thing. And in many ways, a lot of this stuff is going to go forward. And one of the things I think is interesting about Donne uses very kind of different line structures than a lot of the poets of the time period before him, whereas a lot of poets tend to be pretty constant in line structure and length. Donne makes kind of very different choices in terms of line structure and length, and makes more variation than a lot of his contemporaries do, and he seems to be very kind of pushing forward. John Donne's work also kind of is heavily influencing and influences the Romantic poets and things along those lines. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here, and I do recommend you take the time to look at the meters and the rhymes and look at how this kind of stuff is working, because it's very, very interesting, because this is really the time period where we begin to see heavy experimentation in poetry in the English language, and we begin to see English poetry coming into its own and defining itself to some extent from its forebears in Latin. So, as for this week, what you'll be doing in terms of your assignment is, the assignment is going to be the haiku. And the haiku is a little bit different from the tanka, though in a lot of ways it's very, very similar to the tanka. And haikus are actually a classic form of poetry from Japan. Haikus are probably one of the oldest or older forms of poetry that we know of and techniques we know of. And again, like a tanka, it's a syllabic poem. So the haiku, what they tend to do is they tend to place a lot of emphasis on image, and then they have a very kind of tight expression, or sometimes even the image itself is what creates the expression. Haiku are often about nature. That's not always the case anymore, but I really would recommend before you start writing haikus that you read some haikus and check them out and see what's out there. Poets.org has some good examples, but if you just do a Google search for kind of classic haikus, you will find a lot of them. The assignment's fairly simple and difficult. Write a standard 5-7-5 haiku. So you have 5 syllables in one line, 7 syllables in the next line, 5 syllables on the other line. And one of the reasons I really like this exercise is because it forces you to keep your writing concise and kind of really think about what each word you're using and really think about how that delivers. And one of the things that happens when I find that I write haiku is I start cutting out unnecessary words I don't need, such as the articles or the certain adjectives, and it becomes very much about tight nouns, verbs, and the occasional adjective, and you try and create something as strong as possible with that 17 syllables at your disposal. So that's what I'm going to have you folks do this week. Is do the haiku. There's some reading that'll kind of take us forward in history in the Norton Anthology of Poems, but aside from that, that's kind of what we're up to. So if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. As you will notice, we're doing syllabics again, so we are moving closer and closer to metric poems, or we're getting further and further into different degrees of metric. We'll start working in heavier poems here shortly. So, in the heavier forms, which are a bit more complex and difficult here shortly. So if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great week. Take care, be well, and I will talk to you folks again in 7 days.